So good evening, everyone. On behalf of the center, just wanted to welcome Dr. Moore back to the center. He's taught for us a number of times this year, and they've all been amazing teachings. They're all on our YouTube channel. And actually, just in a couple of days, we've got another series on Sundays, the Be Your Own Therapist class with Dr. Moore. And then also next year in January, he'll be teaching another basic program class for us, another 4-month basic program class for us, the Bodhisattva Deeds. So he's a integral part of our virtual online faculty and our family of teachers. So we're really grateful that he's back with us here again tonight. So Dr. Moore, thank you so much, and over to you.
Thank you very much. It's a delight to be here. And I've actually taken the opportunity tonight of presenting a topic in order to fulfill a request that Kabje Zopa Rinpoche made in 2014. So he asked me to talk about my Tonglen practice to the students of FPMT, and I have balked at that because it's very unusual to talk about one's own practice, and especially publicly. And so I'm not going to go into the sort of details of that so much so, but I'm going to present it in a way through the lens of my own experience. So I want to share a background story. In 2011, while attending Lama Zopa's retreat in Bendigo, a teacher centre, Rinpoche took the aspect of having a stroke. The following year, when I was at the Great Enlightenment Stupa in Bodh Gaya to attend teachings with His Holiness the Dalai Lama, and of course, at that time, I was very, very conscious of how incredibly precious are our holy teachers and how our karmic connection with them is actually very, very fragile and can be easily broken. And so I took the opportunity of being at the Great Enlightenment Stupa to make a heartfelt pledge in front of the holy images there that took the shape of a Tonglen meditation in the form of a pledge. So I prayed along the lines, may any obstacles or causes that might prevent Kabje Zopa Rinpoche from remaining with us due to our insufficient merit and broken morality ripen upon me right now. May all the karmic obstacles preventing the students practicing Dharma well and fulfilling the holy wishes of the gurus ripen upon me right now. Due to taking all the students' negative karma, in this way, may Kabje Zopa Rinpoche continue to appear amongst us and lead us to full enlightenment on behalf of all suffering mother sentient beings. Due to taking on the negative karma and giving away all benefits in this way, may Kabje Zopa Rinpoche no longer show the aspect of illness. If I now, this is still sort of the shape of my prayer, if I now myself take on the aspect of illness due to these prayers, how wonderful that would be, as it would be an indication that my prayers had worked. So this prayer in the form of a pledge was also extended to include the long lives of His Holiness the Dalai Lama, Gendoga, who's my precious teacher here in Melbourne, has been so since 1983, and to all other holy gurus. So you must be clear here listening to this story that it's not appropriate to practice Tonglen with one's holy guru as the object, in as much as there's no sense whatsoever that we can take our guru's negative karma, because our guru doesn't have negative karma, and we don't need to give them all benefits leading to full enlightenment, because we see them as already enlightened. We see them in perfected form in this way. And this is an integral part of the teachings of guru devotion, as we know from the graduated path teachings, the Lam Rim. However, I thought to get around this little hurdle in the sense of there's nothing to stop me taking on all the karma of the students that might be in some way damaging or weakening the relationship of the guru with this world in this time. So that's the way I was thinking. And in the background of my thinking was my awareness that Atisha and many other of our precious lineage gurus had made very, very strong prayers while at the Great Enlightenment Stupa, and those prayers had been answered. So I felt that, yes, the same thing could happen with me as well. Not to say I'm a great teacher or great lineage holder, or I'm just a little clumsy student, but the point was it's the power of the object. And if you're there, you have the karma to be there and to make a wish on that scale. Why not do it? That's how it struck me. I was also conscious of whispered stories that at the time of the Tibetan diaspora, when the Lhasa was overwhelmed by the Chinese troops, and many of the Tibetan, including the Sanghas, managed to flee to India, many of the lamas ended up in Buxa, which was a concentration camp during the Second World War, which had been repositioned to take in the Tibetan refugees with the kindness of the Indian government. And at that time, there were observations of threats to His Holiness's life, His Holiness the Dalai Lama's life, and a number of lamas had gone off to do Tonglen retreats to remove any obstacles to His Holiness's long life, and had died in retreat, which was a sign of the success of their practice. So that happens in the case of beings with high realizations. It's not said to be something that will happen if we do Tonglen as sort of ordinary people. So nonetheless, the following year, when I was on pilgrimage in India with the Venerable Sarah Thresher, I did mention what I had prayed for at the stupa, and that's the first time I'd shared the story. And unbeknownst to me, she had mentioned that to Lama Zopa Rinpoche, who at that time was in retreat at Root Institute in Bodh Gaya. And Rinpoche had indicated an interest in the story of my practice. And so later on, during another retreat at a Atisha Center, Lama Zopa Rinpoche had asked me whether I could give some talks on my Tomlin practice. So I've managed to defer it until today. So as a background to this story, in 2010, I had been made aware that I had blood abnormalities during a routine health check. And it was apparent that I had the very, very early stages of MDS, which is like a leukemia. It's a form of bone marrow cancer. And in my case, it was a matter of wait and see. I had absolutely no symptoms at that stage. However, I did begin to develop symptoms and began to weaken. So my regular trips to India to attend His Holiness's Jangchup Lam Rim teachings became increasingly difficult. So I managed to attend in 2012, 2013, and 2014. While attending these teachings, I was very conscious that I was making what could be my final pilgrimage to India. And that struck me as okay, because we're better to die than in the presence of His Holiness the Dalai Lama. So I was aware of this from my first trip to India in, I think, 1985, when His Holiness gave Kala Chakra in Bodh Gaya. And many Tibetans who were sick with terminal illness had come to Bodh Gaya to die during the time of the initiation, and there were funeral pyres all along the banks of the river. So I sort of had this very vivid in my mind. So I just want to convey what was, in a way, a little miracle here. and it concerns not my practice, but the power of the blessings of the Holy Guru. So in 2015, when I attended Sarah J Monastery, where His Holiness was giving teachings to the Sangha there, I had attended with my teacher from Melbourne, the Venerable Geshe Doga, who'd said, you must come, you must come. And at that time, I was having blood transfusions every 3 weeks, without which I wouldn't have been able to live. And the time between blood transfusions was getting closer and closer and closer. And I'd been told that the situation was becoming wretched and that I'd be sort of married to a transfusion machine, if you like, in the not near future. And so the decision to go to India at that time was, from a medical perspective, completely bonkers, completely crazy, because it would have meant that I'd be away for a month. However, I went, and it was difficult, but it was amazingly meaningful, because I was so aware of how precious it was to be able to sit for even 1 minute and listen to teachings from His Holiness the Dalai Lama, and company with Lama Zopa Rinpoche and other Geshe Doga and other great teachers who were there. So the little miracle is that I somehow got to the end of the month, and when I returned to Melbourne, I immediately went to have a blood test. And the remarkable thing was my hemoglobin levels, which had been plummeting after every transfusion, picking up again because of the artificial inflation of the transfusion, and then diving again, were exactly the same as when I'd left to go to India. That's medically impossible to explain. And again, it can only be the blessings of my guru. When I went to get treatment the next day, they retested me, and all my blood levels had begun to go down again, and they plummeted with incredible force. It was as though my health had fallen off the edge of a cliff. So that's the sort of background to it. So in May of 2016, I had a stem cell transplant at the Royal Melbourne Hospital, and this was the only known real treatment for myelodysplasia at that stage. And all the way through that process of being primed for the transplant, which involved massive doses of chemotherapy, strong enough to kill off my entire marrow system. It wasn't enough just to try to kill off cancer. You had to kill the entire blood-producing facility of the body and all of the immune history that you'd ever had. So it's a perilous procedure, and there's a 1 in 3 chances of dying just from the transplant itself. All the way through that time, I continued to do my Tonglen practice, and it took the form of reciting like a mantra the very, very powerful verse from Lama Chopa, the Guru Puja, which says, "And thus, O venerable compassionate gurus, we seek your blessings that all karmic debts, obstacles, and sufferings of mother sentient beings may, without exception, ripen upon me right now, and that I might give over my happiness and virtue to others, and thereby invest all beings in bliss." So I felt that if that was the thought, the wish I had in my mind at that time, I had no reason to fear dying or to worry about the consequences of the procedure. So I think this leads us in to beginning to talk about the significance of this incredible practice, because it presents what is on the surface an outrageous, even shocking proposition. To take on the sufferings of others entirely, we're not just playing here, we're everything we want, really take it, and to give everyone our happiness, all of our happiness, even the last drop. So it does seem crazy from a worldly perspective. So His Holiness recognizes this, and he says, even the thought of experiencing our own suffering, let alone taking on others' suffering, is anathema to most people. Similarly, to consider offering our body, hard-earned wealth, and merit to others is antithetical to our ingrained self-interest. But the fact is that this practice offers an incredibly unique way of securing and strengthening our aspiration to become enlightened on behalf of others, the bodhicitta motivation, if you like. And it's incredibly powerful to practice in the initial phases of the generation of that aspiration, because it protects our aspiring thought and enables it to grow at a time when it might be crushed underfoot by another wave of self-cherishing thought. So doing Tonglen at the time of my own sort of medical crisis had incredible poignancy, because it enabled me to realize the fragility of our human life, together with the reality that at a moment's notice we can die. And of course, we hear this stuff, but when you're actually on the threshold of that, it hits home in a way that has incredible significance. It really rattles us and makes us realize there's no time to waste. And it also means that we begin to look beyond the horizon, if you like, of this lifetime, because our focus, the self-cherishing focus, is so incredibly tight and so incredibly immediately concerned with me, get, not lose, etc., etc. It's wrapped up so tightly it can barely move. So the fact remains that Tonglen practice is incredibly effective in generating a momentum, no matter what stage we find ourselves in. And it completely enables us to begin to work with the actual experience of transforming the mind in a way that's completely different from just mere intellectual or book reading. So it's very, very, very potent in that way. There's nothing abstract. The technique is incredibly immediate. So His Holiness says, the giving and taking practice helps us to further increase our love and compassion and our capacity to exchange self and others. So I'm sure that was an awkward presentation. There are other bits to the story I could tell, but I don't really know how to put them into words in sort of a public forum. So I thought today to present the topic from this point on in my talk from the perspective of a very unique and wonderful presentation given by Geshe Doga in the early 80s. So it's an early teaching. And Geshe Doga on this occasion taught the method via the 4 immeasurable thoughts. So usually this technique is presented within the context of one of the 2 major methods for generating bodhicitta, called exchanging self and others. So that process involves, just to touch upon it, firstly, equalizing ourselves and others by acknowledging that we're alike in not wanting to suffer and to have happiness, exactly alike. We have a level playing field. We then meditate on recognizing the disadvantages of the self-cherishing mind. And in dependence on that, we then generate the mind that's benefiting, wishes to cherish others, and it recognizes the benefits of that. We then feel that we can exchange self and others, and on that basis, we do the Tonglen practice. And so the instructions are given in that framework. While Geshe Doga's presentation implicitly incorporates these points, by presenting it via the 4 immeasurable thoughts, it gives it a very, very immediate practical grounding, one that we can begin to apply right now using our current situations. So in Geshe Doga's presentation, he spent some considerable time discussing what it means to cherish ourselves. And he introduced the idea that when we have minds of jealousy, anger, and attachment, we have an experience of pain, of suffering. And we're also frantic and tense because we're constantly staking out our own ground. It's almost as though the ego, in its craving for its own fulfillment, has to tyrannize the perspective of all others. It has to overwhelm anything else that's going on in the universe in order to continue to feel that it's going to get its own absolute way. And in this way, the self-cherishing mind becomes a base from which all the delusions can operate and flourish. And Geshe Doga gave the wonderful example of like sparrows fighting in a loaf of bread. So I don't know if you've ever seen sparrows fighting in a loaf of bread. I have. You're walking along one day and you see a loaf of bread and you suddenly realize it's moving. You go, "Ugh," bread doesn't move. And you look a bit close and you realize the entire interior of the loaf is full of crazy sparrows. Every now and again a head pops out or a feather, and then they go back to the rummage. It's a brutal and all-consuming procedure inside that loaf. That's what our minds are like. So it's necessary at this point to define delusions. So delusions are secondary consciousnesses which, when they arise, bring unrest and discomfort or disturbance to the mind. I find this definition of delusion in Buddhism absolutely fabulously interesting, because it completely takes away from the idea that we judge a delusion according to some external framework, cosmological sort of litmus test. We measure a delusion by virtue of its own capacity to disturb our mind. And a delusion, when it operates, makes us brittle. It makes us fragile, defensive, combative. If we don't get our own way, depressive. We're temperamental. We become kind of exaggeratedly elated when we suddenly get a little self-cherishing boon. So we're basically unstable. And we are cloyingly self-absorbed. So the great thing is that if we begin to undermine the way in which the ego concept works, it will collapse. It must collapse, because it's based on an artifice, a conceit that it is at the center of reality, and it is actually in a sort of primordial control of things. All of that is an hallucination, a kind of projection, a mad projection produced by the overweening mind of self-cherishing itself, if you like. So in other words, we believe in its projective formulations. So the simile here, if we look a little bit more deeper into the nature of the mind, is that if we put a ruby on a color piece of, a white crystal on a colored piece of cloth, like a red piece of cloth, it will appear like a ruby. The mind appears to take the color of the delusions, but when the conditions for a moment of delusion to arise have settled, the natural clarity of the mind appears. And so Buddha nature is at the heart of the essence of our mind, not self-cherishing. Self-cherishing obscures our Buddha nature because it keeps us too busy to even begin to penetrate into those more lucid, untroubled, or even tranquil areas of the mind. So I'm just going to quote a little passage from the Panchen Lama's debate between wisdom and the self-reifying attitude, the ignorance that's enabling self-cherishing to hold itself together, because it's quite witty, and it also points out the different ways that this mind can engineer and twist and turn to keep itself apparently in front. The Panchen Lama says, some humans are distracted by the acrimony of divisive talk. Others are distracted by their own pretense to having an intimate knowledge of Buddhist doctrine. Some humans are distracted by their attempts to simulate profound meditation. Others are distracted by their efforts to market a simulation of Dharma. Some humans are distracted by their efforts to deceive the faithful. Others are distracted by profitable agricultural pursuits by other commercial interests. Some humans are distracted by the allure of sexual entanglements. Others are distracted by their habituation to intoxicants. Some humans are distracted by their desire to sleep or by laziness. Others are distracted by their engaging in constant idle chatter. Some humans are distracted by their work projects, industrious diversions, creative pursuits, or by recreational activities such as gambling. Others spend their time abiding in a thoughtless daze. All are distracted by being stuck inside the ruts of their own bewildered thinking. So if we want to sum this up, we can say that we can't begin to see or recognize our life opportunity while dominated by this self-cherishing, this egotistical mind. So we need a solution. So Shantideva identifies the problem. He says, since all the injury, fear, and pain in this world arise from the self-centered attitude, what use is that great demon to me? So this is a question we have to pose. But can we usefully conclude at this point, or are we able then to take the next step and begin to transform it, overhaul it, and generate cherishing others, if you like, as in its place? This is the exact inversion of the self-cherishing attitude. How do we begin to do this? So it was at this point that Geshe Doga introduced the 4 immeasurable thoughts as one of the techniques we can apply. The first is immeasurable love, the second immeasurable compassion, the third immeasurable joy, and the fourth immeasurable equanimity. So just a comment that immeasurable joy here doesn't refer to mere temporal happiness, but it's to a happiness that's stable and enduring. And it will only come about when one has obtained what, as Buddhists, we call definite goodness, meaning that we've overcome the sources of samsaric suffering from their very root, and therefore a spontaneous joy arises in every direction spontaneously. So the other point we need to touch on here is, why do we call them immeasurable thoughts? And it's because they're generated towards an immeasurable number of sentient beings, beings as limitless as space. So already the very acknowledgement that we might begin to think of all other beings as immeasurable as space and to consider their welfare, already that is tackling the kind of intense locality or provincialism, this sort of territorial restriction of the self-cherishing attitude. So in other words, the four immeasurables invite us or even compel us to take an active resolve to do something about their situation. So this becomes clear when we look at the forms of the four immeasurables themselves. How wonderful it would be if all sentient beings were to abide in equanimity, free of bias, attachment, and anger. May they abide in this way. I shall cause them to abide in this way. Please, Buddha, bless me that this might be so. How wonderful it would be if all sentient beings had happiness in its causes. May they have happiness in its causes. May I be able to bring this about. Please, precious Buddha, bless me that this might be so. How wonderful it would be if all sentient beings were free of suffering in its causes. May they be free. I shall cause them to be free. Guru Buddha, please bless me to be able to bring this about. How wonderful it would be if all sentient beings were never parted from upper rebirth and liberation's excellent bliss. May they never be parted. I shall cause them never to be parted. Please, Guru Buddha, bless me that this might be so. So you'll notice here that each of the four immeasurables is composed of four internal parts: a wish, an aspiration, may they have, a dynamic resolve or a promise, I shall cause them to have, and finally a call for inspiration. Please, Buddha, bless me that this might be so. So I just want to mention here that these four immeasurable thoughts aren't in any way the exclusive domain of Buddhist practitioners. They are universally applicable to anyone who's wishing to seek ways of somehow generating a more meaningful life, and particularly a life that may be of benefit rather than burden to others. So the four immeasurable thoughts enable us to generate a very powerful conviction in our mind to benefit others while on the run. So when we see a being suffering, we think, may they have happiness and the causes of happiness, and so forth. And so we actually apply the four immeasurables in a dynamic way as we go about our affairs. So it's incredibly practical and incredibly concise as a practice. So I'm now going to focus on two of the four immeasurables, immeasurable love and immeasurable compassion. But I'll just mention that the other two, immeasurable equanimity and immeasurable joy, are embedded in these. So it's not that we're not actually tackling them. So when we talk of immeasurable love, we're not just referring to love as the normal sort of love. To be technical, it's generated within a special meditative absorption. So the power of this absorption means that we're able to generate a love that has a greater range and is more powerful and more stable than an ordinary love. However, the object of normal love, that's our little everyday secular worldly love, and immeasurable love, this sort of vast love that we're discussing, is the same: sentient beings, other beings. But it's said that we must start by recognizing the value of ordinary love if we have any hope of moving on to generating the immeasurable love. So the aspect of love is wishing others to be happy. This is actually a revolutionary thought as far as I can see it. When we have love for someone, we're wishing their happiness. Isn't that remarkable? So when we say that a mother loves her child, she's wishing her child to be happy. It's not about her, it's about her child's welfare. This is the incredible aspect of even ordinary love. And when I say ordinary love, I'm not putting that ordinary love down, because it's the germ of generating this immeasurable love is incredibly important. So while thinking about this, I was considering the terrible plight that's occurring with the war in the Ukraine and the incredible dilemmas that are taking place now, where young people are being conscripted, and in some cases are being asked to fight their fellow Ukrainians. And so here we have a scenario where someone might love their own family with incredible care and devotion, but somehow be put in a situation where they'll perpetrate or be asked to perpetrate harm on another exactly like themselves. And so at that point, love fails, doesn't it? Ordinary love, because it is unable to extend the well wishes to the Ukrainian family that's about to be massacred and thrown into a shallow grave. So I just use that as a really obvious current example. And it also invokes the immeasurable equanimity. May all beings be free of holding some close and others distant, because this is the kind of divisive mechanism that is enabling people to disassociate, depersonalize the other, who's exactly like themselves, sufficiently to be able to wipe them out, if you like. So the aspect of love is wishing that others have happiness, and it's the opposite of the selfish thought. So we need to contrast this with the unselfish mind, which recognizes the importance of others and cares for their happiness more than our own. And I see many examples of this when I visit the hospital, and in the leukemia ward, you often see a parent with their child with leukemia, and the way they're taking care of that child is unbelievable to witness, to have the privilege of witnessing. It is so extraordinarily patient, so extraordinarily loving, and so extraordinarily compassionate. They're going to be there with them on that journey and face the reality of it in the most extraordinarily nurturing and wonderful ways. This is really, really quite something to see. However, it's necessary to contrast that kind of love with attachment, which appears to have the same aspect. But when we begin to delve into attachment, we recognize that as soon as a loved object, according to ordinary love, shifts significantly or changes, we have this capacity to kind of ditch it, abandon it, and discard it. And so many relationship failures, of course, revolve around these sorts of issues. We get partners swapping out their partners for another one, don't we? Who somehow is going to give them more happiness than the one who's being used up now, or they've gone to university and we didn't want a successful partner with an academic career when we're working as a plumber or something. So we decide to separate. This is attachment because it cannot accommodate any change in the object. Love doesn't have that aspect. It's able to, if anything, embrace the care of that person even more so when they enter a situation of trouble and strife. So in other words, genuine love is untroubled by the vicissitudes of life, but attachment will become enraged and begin to try to remanipulate, to reconstellate things to serve its immediate need, even at the cost of another person's sanity or welfare. So there are various methods for dealing with attachment, and the Lam presents many of them, and I won't go into those, but I'll just touch on one, which is recognizing impermanence, and also recognizing how, when we have strong hatred, for example, towards someone, the portion of hatred that makes that person so incredibly unattractive and unpleasant to us, according to our hateful stance, is being projected by our self-cherishing attitude. So this portion of projection of ugliness, if you like, detestability, repulsion that we're implanting into the object through attachment is being seen by the mind generating attachment as an inherent feature or quality of the object itself. This is an utter fabrication. It is not true. And so understanding this mechanism of projection also enables us to begin to take control a little bit more about the way the mind of attachment works. So Geshe Doga asked us, when we're trying to work in this way, to work at seeing the attractive sides of people, finding values there, and trying to stop the power of negative projection that's overlaying the way the object's appearing. So Geshe Doga made a quip at this point of his explanation. He said, it is in fact quite unlikely that we are going to find, being a person the way we are, an enlightened, fully enlightened partner. So in other words, self-cherishing wants the very best for itself, and it cannot accommodate the fact that someone is somehow falling short. And so this is crazy thinking. So the value of meditating on love more generally is that the individual peace that we'll generate within ourselves can lead to world peace. In fact, it's the only source of world peace. And we can also distinguish right from wrong. So it enables us to act as responsible moral citizens. And it's also the case that love towards others will be automatically reciprocated. And so we'll find ourselves in a more nurturing environment. And I think this is really one of the special aspects of love, is that it safeguards and ripens the field of virtue in which another being lives. In other words, a being can flourish and attain their own value, their own sort of achievements, their own accomplishments, if they're nourished in a bed of love. Because there's nothing in that scenario that is there to block or to harm their quest for fulfillment. So we now move to immeasurable love. And immeasurable love is distinguished because it's completely applied to each and every sentient being without exception. And this immeasurable love is said to have incredible benefits to us as practitioners, because it means it will be no longer harmed or easily harmed by opposing forces or attacks and so forth. We're protected. We protect ourselves in a very, very deep and special way. It's also said that if we can generate immeasurable love, we can also have higher rebirths, and our mind will become very soft and very flexible, very adaptive, very open to transformation. So these are all opposite characteristics, aren't they, to the self-cherishing mind. And so the aspect of immeasurable love is wishing others to have happiness. The delusion that's overcome by generating immeasurable love is harmful thoughts. And the function is to mature the mental continuum of other beings. And this is referring to enabling them to travel towards happiness in a wonderful way. So it's not just enough to say, it's easy enough to say, but it's not just enough to say, may all beings have happiness and its causes. It must be felt from the very heart. And this involves achieving a great empathy, a great sympathy for others. And so Buddhism at this point presents love in three ways, and I'll just touch on this. Love that observes sentient beings who are suffering, love that observes sentient beings who are subject to change, impermanence, and love that observes sentient beings who are dominated by ignorance that is distorting the way in which reality appears. So each of these loves, if you like, observations becomes more and more subtle, so that even if we see someone who isn't superficially unhappy, we can still wish them love, because we recognize that that happiness they have is itself not secure unless they do a lot of additional work. And therefore they're a worthy object of care, a worthy object of love. And because they're being ruled by distorted thought, the delusions, in other words, they're definitely an object of our immeasurable love, because things can come unstuck and become very, very disastrous in a very short space of time. So Shantideva at this point, sort of invokes, if you like, a qualm that the self-cherishing attitude will have. It begins to contemplate immeasurable love. And I quote, "If I give, what will be left for me? Concern for my own welfare is the attitude of demons. If I keep this, what will be left to give? Concern for others' welfare is the approach of the divine beings. All the joy the world contains has come through wishing the happiness of others. All the misery the world contains has come through wanting pleasure for myself." So this leads us into the Tonglen practice of giving, because we realize that the aspect of immeasurable love is to give, and to give to all beings. So we've established that as our framework. So we need now to consider what it is we can give. And we can give our body, we can give material resources and possessions, and we can give the roots of virtue, which are the sort of the karmic imprints that will ripen in states of happiness in the future. Our own good karma, in other words. We give this away so that others can enjoy it rather than ourselves. So when Geshe Doga described the giving of the body, he mentioned that his own description is based on his practice, which is itself based on many texts. And in particular, one by Geshe Chekwa, which says, "Banish the object of every blame. Meditate on the great kindness of all. Practice a combination of both giving and taking. Commence taking progressively from your own side. Place these two astride the breath." So at this point, I'd like to make a very quick, present a very quick history of the lineage of the Tonglen teachings, because it's incredibly inspiring. So the thought transformations, or Lojong teachings, of which Tonglen is a crucial part, derive directly from Shakyamuni Buddha. And the source is found in the sutras, the various teachings that have been given. These lineages of teachings were transmitted through a succession of highly accomplished meditation masters of India, and were compiled by the great Pandit Atisha, who was born as a prince to a royal dynasty in Bengal in year 982. And Atisha studied with over 150 spiritual teachers and travelled to northern India, from northern India to the island of Sumatra, in order to receive the exchanging self and others lineage, which I mentioned earlier on as one of the crucial mechanisms for generating the precious mind of bodhicitta, which contains these teachings. So while at the sacred site of Bodh Gaya, Atisha had a vision from which he understood that his principal teacher of generating the awakening mind did reside on the island of Sumatra. And so because of that sort of prediction, or if you like, or prophecy, he made the very arduous trip there and met with his spiritual master, Selingpa, from whom he received the teachings, the extensive teachings for generating the mind of awakening mind of enlightenment. For the last 17 years of his life, Atisha lived in Tibet, and before passing away in 1054, he had the opportunity to transmit the thought transformations teachings to his closest disciple, Drom Tompa, who is considered as an incarnation of Avalokiteshvara, the Buddha of compassion, and an earlier incarnation of His Holiness the Dalai Lama. It was from Drom Tompa and the works of Atisha that the Kadam tradition of Tibetan Buddhism flourished. The thought transformation teachings will pass through the Kadam masters, Geshe Pothowa, Geshe Langri Tangpa, and Sharawa to Geshe Chekawa, who compiled them into the easily comprehensible form known as the 7-verse thought transformation. Geshe Langri Tangpa had written another famous Lojong text called Thought Transformation in 8 stanzas. Many of us will know that text, which contains the verse which sit at the heart of my talk today, which is, "In short, I shall offer benefit and bliss to all my mothers, in this actual life and in all future continuum, and secretly I shall take upon myself all the harms and sufferings of my mothers." So the question comes here, in what sense is this technique of Tonglen secret? So Geshe Doga indicated that secret here doesn't mean it's a secret practice that no one else is allowed to know. He said, rather, it indicates that it's a mental practice that might not be useful or helpful to explain to someone else. So in other words, it may only be appropriate to be explained in certain receptive circumstances. And I think this is because of its shocking counterintuitive proposition. If we don't understand it in detail, what's underlying that radical proposition to take on suffering and to give away all our happiness, we're going to see this technique as sort of wild, bizarre, and even destructive, which of course is the opposite of the case. So Geshe Chekawa went on a search for these precious teachings. So from the time of Atisha and Drom Tompa, the thought transformations were kept secret and were only passed to disciples who were capable and willing to put them into immediate practice. So as mentioned before, the first to write them down was Kadampa Geshe Langri Tangpa, who was amongst the 8 close disciples of Geshe Pothowa, who was the only one to receive them from him. This later Geshe had been a direct disciple of Drom Tompa, and it was upon reading the verse quoted above, just quoted, that Geshe Chekawa was inspired to search for these teachings and later compose the 7-point thought transformation based on the old instructions of Geshe Charawa, a disciple of Geshe Langri Tangpa. So inspired by this unusual idea that you should accept all blame and suffering onto yourself and give away all profit, gain, and happiness, Geshe Chekawa travelled to Lhasa, the capital of Tibet, in search of the master who held this oral tradition and who would be able to explain it to him. Upon arriving and circumambulating at the main temple, he asked people there who was the master who could teach him this text. He was told how to reach the town where the author of this verse lived. But when he arrived, he discovered that Geshe Langri Tangpa had already passed away. He then travelled to the monastery of Geshe Charawa, a renowned teacher who was a disciple of Langri Tangpa. When he arrived, he found Geshe Charawa giving a teaching on the path of hearers, or one of the Hinayana traditions. Confused and disappointed at the lack of mention of bodhicitta, or the awakening mind, he felt that he must search still further for the teaching on these 2 lines. giving and taking. So when the discourse was over, Geshe Chekawa waited for Charawa to pass the retreat house of the monastery as he made his customary morning circumambulation. As was traditional practice for requesting teachings, Geshe Chekawa laid a cloth on the ground and called to Geshe Charawa. And as he approached, he said, "Please sit. I have some questions to ask you concerning the Dharma." Indignant at being stopped, Geshe Charawa replied, "I cut all doubts, leaving nothing unclear when I gave the discourse before. Where were you then, and what more do you have to ask?" Chekawa then explained to him about the lines from the book and asked whether it had any substantial reference. He explained that if it had, his only desire was to learn about it. To which Geshe Charawa answered, "Whether you like to study it or not, if you want to attain complete enlightenment, you must understand its meaning." The scriptural authority of this verse is a verse from the Spirit of the Precious Garland by the Superior Nagarjuna, which says, "May I be as dear to sentient beings as their own life, and may they be very dear to me. May their negativities ripen upon me, and all my virtues for them." So he was then convinced that the lines in the 8 verses of thought transformation had a sound basis. He then returned to see Charawa and asked him if he could spend more time in the study of its meaning with him, to which Charawa agreed. So then Geshe Chekawa asked why Charawa had not spoken about the awakening mind when he was giving his discourse before. And in a mood of despair, Charawa said it was of no use to mention it to others who knew of it, since few people were genuinely interested in generating the awakening mind. Nevertheless, Chekawa was able to spend almost 12 years with Geshe Charawa and receive the full teachings on thought transformation, and he meditated intensely on all that he'd learnt. So out of his infinite compassion for all sentient beings, he composed all he'd learned into the 7-point thought transformation verses, which contain the key lines which I quoted earlier, and I'll quote again. "Banish the one object of every blame, meditate on the great kindness of all, practice a combination of both giving and taking, commence taking progressively from your own side, place these two astride the breath." So in the Book of Kadam, which is a compilation of Atisha's teachings, we find the verse, quote, "Urged by powerful forces of loving kindness and compassion, with no hint of possessiveness, I give my body, possessions, and roots of virtue to my kind, destitute parents, whatever they desire." So you can see here the 3 objects of immeasurable love are also identified. Giving body, possessions, and roots of virtue. Roots of virtue is more than just virtue. It's the roots of virtue. It's the very karmic imprint that has been left on our mind stream through having performed an act of kindness, for example. So it's our own potential for happiness in dependence on that act of kindness that we've performed that we're giving away. So you can see here it has a very deep meaning. So in order to practice this, so we're actually now up to the point of practicing the Tonglen instructions, we pick the kindest person to us. And we're using the word to us here in a relative way. We want to, in order for this practice to really grip, we need to pick someone who we really, really care about now and who we love. And we'll say it's our mother. So we visualize our mother in the space in front. And this is actually one of the remarkable things about this technique, is that we can do it for our mother who's deceased, by the way. Some of us will have deceased mothers, and some of us will have estranged mothers. And there may even be cases of people who've been unknowingly adopted at birth, of not even knowing who their mother is. This practice can still be done towards them and has a great healing capacity to do that. So we visualize them in the space in front, and then we contemplate that they have no happiness, they have lots of suffering, and how awful it is that they have to endure this suffering, and how wonderful it would be if they had happiness and joy, free of even the origins of the causes of suffering. How wonderful it would be if they were totally free of the delusions, so they could see how to move ahead in a constructive way in their own lives. So we then generate a strong feeling. I will do something to remove this suffering from my dear mother. And at this point, we manifest mentally a radiant light from our heart, which goes towards our mother. And as it absorbs into our mother, we feel that all of her sufferings, all of her problems, all of her delusions, all of her fears, all of her doubts, all of her physical and mental problems, etc., dissolve away. It's like floodgates, sluicing them away. And due to this, we feel that she's now become a suitable vessel or vehicle for achieving liberation and full enlightenment. And so at this point of the visualization, we transform our mother's ordinary body into the enlightened body of a Buddha. So this could be Tara or any other Chenrezig or any other of the enlightened manifestations we choose. But the point is that we feel that our mother is now in an actualized, enlightened state. Her mind has become an enlightened mind. Her body has become an enlightened mind. So we do this practice repeatedly. And we do it particularly, of course, when our mother upsets us. We still have a mother who's alive and she upsets us. We sit down and we do this practice on the spot, because this is the way of working with our own emotional afflictions that are going to twist us up and make us attack our mother or spurn our mother or blame our mother with our brothers by telling stories of our brothers and sisters and so forth. All of that stuff can come to an end if we sit down and do this meditation of giving in this way. Then, on the basis of gaining some experience, we extend the technique by increasing the field of the visualization. So, as well as our mother, we visualize friends behind her. And again, we can pick particular friends and position them very carefully to make them seem to be as actual and as real as possible. And then behind our friends, we visualize humans. And behind humans, animals. And behind animals, all the beings in the other realms, including those in the hungry ghost and hell realms, and even those in the upper realms. And we expand their number to infinity so that we don't leave one single being out. And of course, in this expansion, this exponential kind of dilation of the visualization, we're not losing sight of the keenness of that incredible concern to give them happiness in exactly the same forceful way that we gave happiness to our mother. If we lose that edge, that kind of personal edge, we're generating a kind of generic thought, oh, may all beings have happiness. But we don't feel it. We're not actually part of a resolve to bring that about. So this conclusion after we've transformed all beings into Buddhas, is to leave them as they are and to meditate on emptiness. This is the ideal conclusion to the meditation. So this technique is incredibly adaptable. So in the case of someone who we know who's suddenly been diagnosed with cancer, we visualize them in the same way that we visualized our mother, and we give them a healthy body. We give them a healthy heart, or a healthy whatever it is that they need in order to remain happy. So we can be very, very particular and detailed in our approach to the technique. And in the case of people who are hungry or are struggling financially, we visualize giving them food and resources and so forth, the homeless, houses. There's no limit to the amount of kind of elaboration that we can apply creatively to the way in which we're giving. So although we're using a radiant light, we feel that it's embodying all of these particular aspects that we're generating outwards. So in that way, we've given our body, we've given wealth and resources, and by wishing them to have a long lifespan and to meet all the conditions for future happiness, we're giving away our roots of virtue, very imprints that I've mentioned before. Now, when Geshe Dogo was presenting this topic, he asked us to make a special adjustment in the case of giving to an enemy, and suggested that it's necessary to do a little bit of work there. We have to somehow turn that aspect of enemy-ness that's appearing to us when we visualize that person into an attractiveness, such as we might feel when we view our dear mother. And this takes a bit of work. So if we skirt around this task, we're not going to be able to generate immeasurable anything, because we're effectively saying, may all sentient beings have happiness except for this one person who I consider an enemy. So we've failed to fulfill that promise. Now we move on to the second wing of the technique, which is taking. And so I'm going to quote from the Book of Kodam, based on Atisha's oral teachings, which I quoted earlier, verse 9. Like in the exemplary life of our teacher, Munindra, I will contemplate the benefits of cherishing others, and all the non-virtuous karma and suffering of others I shall take upon myself and purify. So you can see here, this has the opposite aspect in terms of its metabolism as a meditation. We're not giving out, we're forcibly taking in. And we're taking in their suffering, their pain, their unhealthy bodies, their torment in a hellish realm, and so forth. And we're doing this with absolute openness and candor. And in order to do this, we need to create a very particular visualization, which is our own self-cherishing attitude, which I described at the beginning of the talk. And we take that and visualize it in the form of a kind of black lump in the heart. And this black lump is a condensation of all of our own self-cherishing negativity from beginningless time, because it's precisely the obstacle that's blocking us from actually being able to take on the suffering of others and to give them happiness. And when we take, we bring in the problem, and as it strikes or hits that lump in our heart, it dismantles it, it pulverizes it, it deconstructs it, makes it completely fall apart so that not even one molecule is left. So it takes a bit of practice getting a feel for this description of what we do, but it does actually work, because of course you're going to say, oh, I've just dissolved my self-cherishing attitude, how can I then keep taking? Well, of course you can. So you re-establish the self-cherishing thought again, and you bring in the negativities of the other, and it again pulverizes your self-cherishing attitude. And then again, you continue the meditation. And so it involves a repetition which keeps the reality of the base of why you're doing the technique constantly in frame, which is trying to destroy the self-cherishing attitude and generate its opposite. So immeasurable compassion is what we're dealing with in the process of taking, because compassion has the opposite aspect to love, in as much as we're wishing to take on the suffering of others. So in love, we're wishing to give them happiness. With compassion, we're wishing to take on their suffering. And this powerful mind of wishing to take on their suffering has the incredible power to prevent us from harming others. Just think about that for a moment. How could you go to war if your main concern was to take on the suffering of others? You couldn't possibly drop that bomb or shoot that gun, could you? And so it's very, 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 very potent as a mind. And so the function of love, compassion is generally the same as love, in that it enables the ripening of other beings, including ourselves, to spirituality and happiness. And if we can generate compassion, we'll have much less confusion in our own mind, and will also cause much less confusion in the mind of others, because I know exactly where we're coming from. Of course, most people are guarding themselves against being injured, aren't they? And so we're suspect when we see someone else thinking, are they there to help me or to harm me? And of course, intelligently, we have to be aware of such things, because harm is real. And so this technique is saying that we can begin by wishing to take on the suffering, even of the enemy. This requires very, very careful work again, but it is possible to transform that appearance of the enemy into a friend. And so there are various questions that might arise here spontaneously, good questions, such as, are you asking me, using this technique, to see my enemy who's about to attack me as my friend, and therefore sit down and do Tonglen meditation while the attack goes on? No, I'm not saying that. I'm saying that if we can actually engage this technique in our own personal practice, when we meet with a difficult situation in life, we'll know exactly how to proceed in a skillful manner that will minimize the harm given to ourselves and the harm given to the other. So there'll be no need for retributive rage, for example. If someone offends us, we don't have to shoot them with a gun. We just don't simply have to pick up a gun at all, do we? We can just simply say, could you please apologize? You know, a calmer mind is able to navigate the world in a very, very different way to the self-cherishing mind. So there are many ways of talking about compassion, and particularly a great compassion, an immeasurable compassion. And Chandrakirti has a very famous verse, which I'll quote. As compassion alone is accepted to be the seed of the perfect harvest of Buddhahood, the water that nourishes it, and the fruit that is the source of long enjoyment, I'll praise compassion at the start of all. And so compassion in this presentation is being seen to be critical, of crucial importance at the beginning of our practice, meaning now, because it enables us to begin to cultivate the source of the rich harvest of Buddhahood by nurturing its substantial cause, which is love and compassion. And it's important in the middle, because it nourishes that tiny little shoot that's begun to sprout by providing all of the ancillary supportive conditions that will enable it to grow. And this is referring to practices of the 6 perfections and pure morality and so forth that support that practice. And at the end, compassion is important because the fruit itself of compassion is the source of all of the Buddha's activities. And so the Buddha is teaching out of pure compassion. That's why the teachings are available to us. So His Holiness often, when he talks about compassion, gives some very moving examples of nature. And he mentions that when he was a little boy, he used to stand on the parapets of the Patala Palace, watching the birds. I think they were a sort of tern, mother birds, kicking their fledglings out of the nest that had been sort of made in spaces, gaps between the stones at a very high altitude. And of course, the birds have to leave the nest. They have to learn to fly, but because they haven't flown before, they hit the ground and flutter and attract eagles and hawks. And His Holiness talks about how the mother will fly down onto the ground and run around and then run away as a decoy to lure the hawks and the eagles away from the babies. And so he gives us an example of compassion in nature and said how incredibly moved he was to witness that as a small boy. So in order to actually engage in the meditation, it's different to giving in as much we're starting the practice up for the first time. We picked our mother, a dear loved one, didn't we? In this taking portion of the meditation, the incredible thing is that we pick, guess whom? Ourselves. We recognize that we as one person are suffering and have the causes of suffering. So we visualize ourselves in the space in front and then take our own suffering in the form of smoke or gunk that pours into the self-cherishing attitude and totally obliterates it. And then when we're familiar with that process, we do the meditation on behalf of others by expanding the field of the visualization as we did before with giving, but we also make sure that we find ways of also incorporating the enemy. And not just the enemy, but the meaningless person. Because the Buddhist presentation of equanimity or the equality of self and others here is that we care a lot for the friend, and in a sort of reverse way, we care a lot about the enemy, but there's a whole lot of people out there that we don't frankly care about at all. They haven't registered on our ego radar. And so we have to break open that tightness and embrace all beings by taking on the suffering of all beings, no matter who they are. So we pick ourselves and we take on our suffering. And we do that with the force that is like the feeling would have if we were about to be executed in 1 hour. We've got 1 hour left. What do we feel or think? We take on with that kind of force. That person's situation is so perilous, so difficult, so dangerous. I must take it now, right now. That's how emphatic, how forceful it is. So it's not sort of a twee, delicate thing at all. It can be very, very kind of powerful in the way it moves in our being. So we get right inside of the situation, and we don't just take their superficial problems, we take their deepest problems, their real problems. So the visualization for others is the same, and we perform the meditation on that same basis. So it's the same taking, but we just have expanded the field of the observation, if you like. So there are many detailed variations of these visualization techniques, but the basic kind of momentum that I've described, this 2-part movement, of giving and taking is the crucial point. And when we've achieved some familiarity with both of those portions of the technique, we can combine them together by placing them upon the breath. So with the in-breath, we take, and with the out-breath, we give. And if we're experienced in the technique, because we've been sitting on our cushions, developing our capacity to do the meditation, we can find that we can do that meditation, a complete cycle of Tonglen, if you like, in the space of an in and out breath. This is truly a remarkable thing to contemplate, because if we can do that with the force that I just described, this incredibly powerful feeling, yes, may their suffering ripen on me right now, may my happiness flourish and be given to them right now. We have a way of working with situations in the very concourse of our lived lives. So as we encounter situations of whatever kind, we can see ways of engaging the technique. So, for example, when I see that mother with her child with leukemia, I'm just giving myself an example here, I don't just think, oh, that poor mum, the poor kid. That's pity, isn't it? I do Tonglen practice. When I see someone stumbling as they try to get off a tram, which is a major form of public transport here in Melbourne, it's very difficult for the elderly and the infirm to take that step onto what is often a very busy and dangerous road. I practice taking their ailing body and giving them a perfect body with an in and out breath. And I wanted to add here, I don't just sit on the curb doing the meditation. I'd go and help the old lady down from the tram. But if we practice Tonglen in as many situations as we can, we'll see the opportunity to run across and help the old lady down from the tram. It will arise spontaneously as what we can do, because we've rehearsed our mind in this incredibly dynamic and real way using the technique of Tonglen. And if we have a fight with our boss at work, we put them there, we take on all this suffering and give them all happiness, transform them into a radiant Buddha, and go to work the next day, feeling differently than we would have if we hadn't done the technique. And again, I'm speaking from experience here. I had to do it with, I won't mention names, my boss at one stage, and I was having, a difficult time. It was a difficult situation. And on this occasion, when I sat down and did Tomlin and went to work the next day, I found myself having a normal conversation with her for the first time in months. So you might ask, how come? Was it magic? Well, it kind of was magic. It's the magic of the technique, because something had shifted because of the practice. And I was able to somehow see my boss, I suppose, as the person she was. She was struggling in her job. It was a difficult job, and she was pressed into a corner, and she was sort of doing things rather desperately in difficult ways. And I'd been responding through self-cherishing attitudes and re-maneuvering and fighting back and so forth. And it was a mess. So this technique completely interrupted that process and enabled a new kind of relationship to form, a healthy one, in other words. And so this riding on the breath is the fulfillment of the technique, because it's incredibly condensed and easy to do when we've practiced it. So I'm conscious I've only got a few more minutes to go of my talk. I just wanted to just make a few rounding off comments. If we want to really generate a Bodhi mind, an awakening mind, we have to begin to transform our actual emotional experience and attitudes. And that involves navigating the mechanisms of self-cherishing head on and overhauling the way we work with it. And so the Tonglen practice provides a perfect mechanism for doing that in each and every situation. So it's truly remarkable how potent this technique is, because it frees us from being a slave of the self-cherishing mind. It interrupts it and opens up a space for us to dwell and operate from, which will in turn give rise to our own innate capacity to be a wiser, kinder, more compassionate, more helpful, more beneficial person. It can completely overhaul our social reality in the process. So just to quickly describe the technique, as we breathe out from the right nostril, we send out radiant white light. All the goodness that we're emanating enters into the left nostril of each and every sentient being and eliminates all obstacles and bestows higher status and definite emergence. And then as we breathe in through the left nostril, we see gunk and sort of dark light coming from the right nostril of each and every sentient being and coming into our own left nostril and then pouring into our heart and destroying completely all of our self-cherishing attitude, and in the process totally obliterates all of the negativities that we've taken on from them, leaving absolutely no trace. And out of that spaciousness of no trace of the egotistical attitude, when we next breathe out, we can do that with an incredible purity that we weren't capable of doing a moment before, because we've just annihilated our self-cherishing attitude. And so we can take more suffering than we could do before and destroy even more subtle self-cherishing and give even more subtle benefit to others. And so the technique intensifies and deepens itself through its own internal process. Its own effectiveness is built into the technique itself. So as a conclusion, engaging in the conjunction of love and compassion together with this method of giving and taking, provides the very best method of generating the altruistic mind of bodhicitta. And I'd like to quote His Holiness here. When making aspirational prayers, we should utter from the very depths of our hearts the following lines from a guide to a bodhisattva's way of life. My own happiness and other suffering, if I do not thoroughly exchange them, I will not become fully enlightened. In this cyclic existence too, I'll find no joy. So His Holiness elaborates. He says, this verse presents a specific Buddhist practice known as giving and taking, and it is by means of visualizing of giving and taking that we practice equalizing and exchanging self for others. This practice, this is Holiness's words, carries us to the very heart essence of our spiritual practice, or indeed our very reason or purpose of being alive. The practice of Tonglen, giving and taking, encapsulates the practices of loving kindness and compassion. The practice of giving emphasizes the practice of loving kindness, whereas the practice of taking emphasizes the practice of compassion. So I might finish there, but I thought to dedicate by reciting the words of the four immeasurable thoughts, but as we do so, to sort of infuse them with this mind, bodhicitta. How wonderful it would be if all sentient beings were to abide in equanimity, free of bias, attachment, and anger. May they abide in this way. I shall cause them to abide in this way. Please, Buddha, inspire me to be able to do so. How wonderful it would be if all sentient beings had happiness in its causes. May they have happiness in its causes. I shall cause them to have happiness in its causes. Please, precious Buddha, inspire me to be able to do so. How wonderful it would be if all sentient beings were free of suffering and its causes. May they be free of suffering and its causes. I shall cause them to be free. Guru Buddha, please inspire me to be able to do so. How wonderful it would be if all sentient beings were never parted from upper rebirth and liberation's excellent bliss. May they never be parted. I shall cause them never be parted. Guru Buddha, please inspire me to be able to do so. So I've covered a fair bit of ground there, but I've tried to present in a way that is approachable at any point of starting a practice, because that's the great challenge and the great invitation here, is to actually try the technique yourselves and see or feel the benefits that come from it. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Moore.
Thank you very much.